Hello and Assalamu alaikum. I am Parvez Khan. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Cohort University of Science and Technology. The subject is Media Law, Ethics and Literacy. The course code is JMC 351. It's our lecture number 10, which is Harm Limitation Principle. So before we start our lecture, we'll be talking about the objectives, what the students will gain. So students will be able to understand what harm limitation principle is, and they will be able to understand that the words, pictures, and stories have consequences, and that journalism is not sensationalism, and that harm can be minimized with good journalistic practices. So, what we know is that it's important to understand the changing face of journalism with new dynamics and new mediums. It's very important to understand that the basics of journalism remain the same. Is that harm can be contained with good journalistic practices. So, we'll be talking more about that in our lecture. The technology has changed with the rising fake news, with the rising conglomerates and chains of channels. It's very important to understand that media can cause more damage than good if it's not done properly, if it's not done with caution, if it's some elements are not taken into consideration, so it can cause a lot of harm. And that's why we often talk about ethics, and why this is even more important, because ethics is not just a word or definition, it's more about good practices. So this is what we are focusing on in this lecture, and this is what good journalistic practices are all about, that to change the world according to good journalistic practices, to highlight more, to make this world a better place. This is what the essence of true journalism is, and ethics has a key role to play in. Uh, let's talk about that words and images have consequences. And it's important to understand that no matter what you say online or what you say on the television or the medium as a reporter, they can have consequences. Even the images have consequences. So a lot needs to be taken into consideration when it comes to reporting, when it comes to journalistic practices, or when it comes to standard journalism. And this is why we are discussing what is harm limitation principle. But before we go into that, I would like to share a quote, which is that neither in law nor equity can there be personal liberty to any man, which shall be bondage and ruin to his fellow men. And which summarize it can be that personal liberty is important, but as long as if you're going to harm others, that is going to be a serious problem. And this is what this is a quote of John B. Finch, and it's very important to understand that personal liberty doesn't mean that you go out and say whatever you think it's right. There's a lot to take into consideration. There's a lot to think about victims. There's a lot to think about how your words can cause harm as a journalist. So there's a lot to take into consideration. And Society of Professional Journalists were the first one who wrote a code for ethics in 1926. Among the pioneers of ethics, usually we quote them, and they re-revised. There are four key principles that I would like to talk about Society of Professional Journalists, which is SPJ, sorry, and that usually talk about that. We quote the ethics from there mostly. We discuss them. These are the four principles. The first one is to seek truth and report it. This is one of the key principles of code of ethics, that you should seek truth and report it no matter what the consequences. You must try to see how the journalism is all about upholding truth. And as a journalist, there's a responsibility on you to report it. But as long as you're reporting it, there's another thing which is the topic of today, is that you should minimize the harm. This is very important, that as long as you know that you're reporting truth, you're seeking truth, or you're reporting truth, you must also think about minimizing harm. Will your report cause any harm? Will your words or have any consequences? Will your images cause a lot of problems to the victims? So this is what we'll be talking about in today's lecture. And similarly, we have to act independently. And the last one is to be accountable ourselves. So as a journalist, one should understand that being a journalist is not a license to arrogance. You cannot go out and start reporting things from your own. You should be accountable. That's why sources are important. You cannot quote things out of yourself. So seeking truth and reporting it is there, act independently is there, be accountable is there, but one must always think about minimizing harm. Can our report cause harm? Can our words cause harm? Can the images cause harm? Yes, it can. And this is why we're going to talk about harm limitation principle. and which is the act of determining what information to report and how to report it. And then equally it's important that journalists should handle, and the journalists handle a lot of sensitive information in their careers, and which is why it's they're in power that certain information should be shared or not. And there are explicit guidelines which journalists should take, and as a journalist they should take these guidelines into consideration before making these decisions. This is what harm limitation principle is: to consider how what you're going to say is it going to cause any consequences. So the principle of harm limitation requires withholding certain sensitive information from reports, which it can be juvenile victims, victims of sex crimes, or suspects before they're formally charged. Like, you cannot just go out and name people just like you want to just sell out the news. You just want to inform people for the sake of entertainment. This is not entertainment. News is all about lives and consequences. If you are going to name out people, especially juvenile suspects who are very underage young people who are accused of certain crimes and certain small thefts, if you're going to report about it, what will be the consequence? Similarly, it can be sex crimes. Do you think it's appropriate to name them before if it's in the larger interest of people? And similarly, suspects, before they're even charged, it's in the times of YouTubers, people just go out there, they just speak about it, they just say that, oh, he's they just in Urdu they say, they just make him a mujrim, instead he's a mulzim. So this is what we have to think about. Our job is not to become a judge. We have to, as a journalist, we have to think about it, what we are saying. So what should journalists do? The first one, the journalist should be compassion. He should be compassionate. He must be thinking about children and vulnerable groups. And along with being compassionate, it's very important to have a certain degree of sensitivity, to think about the victims of crimes. It's not just that you just go out there as a robot. You have certain feelings. You have to think about it, that these are people out there. This is not just a story that you want to sell out. These are people. You have to think about them. Then their right to privacy. Privacy is important because every individual has the right to withhold certain information about themselves. And then the last one is about juvenile or sex victim names. Do we have to name them? And then similarly, we discussed the avoiding the suspect's name before they're formally charged. So, combining all these points, um, what we can say is that one should think before we write or shoot. And as a journalist, it's very important to think before you write or shoot, because what you are going to write or what you're going to present in the form of images, they will have consequences. And it's very important to think about victims, think about people whom you're going to interview, whom you're going to talk about, because they have families, they're living in societies, they have to live on, and one must also consider the impact of culture and society on them, how they will respond to it. Will they accept them despite what happened? So what happens usually is that the victims whose stories are shared, they usually suffer more because the society doesn't accept them the same way, or they are pressurized into other things. So this is important. So this is what brings us towards our first point, which is compassion. And compassion is like, we must show it to the people who have been affected very seriously by news. Like, we must use special sensitivity when dealing with children and inexperienced sources. Like, you just cannot go out and take a mic and ask them how you're feeling. And such, we usually ask them, "Aap kaisa mehsoos kar rahe hain?" Obviously, they are in trouble. You cannot just ask them, "Aap kaisa mehsoos kar rahe hain?" How you're feeling. This is very critical. This is the most common question in Urdu journalism that we see. That we just go out, we take out the mic and ask them how you're feeling. Obviously, they're feeling very bad. They're going through trauma. You have to be very sensitive for what you're asking. The questions you're putting forward, the story you're going, requires a lot of compassion. One must also understand that what you would have done if it was you. So compassion is very important, and it brings us to our next point, which is sensitivity, that one should be sensitive when seeking information, especially during the interviews of photographs who have been affected by tragedy or grief. What we've seen usually is, especially during the coverage of violence or the bomb blast, that usually we take out our cameras and we just go out and ask the victims that what they're feeling, and without their permission, usually we take out and shoot their mourning scenes where they're crying, where they're in grief. We try to record them without the permission. That's really bad journalism, because you haven't asked them, you haven't taken the permission, and one should be sensitive. How would you feel if someone comes to your home and does the same, if you are in tragedy or if you're in pain? So, as a journalist, it's very important to have both compassion and sensitivity. And then, in connection to this, there's privacy. Recognize people's right to privacy. They have a greater right to control information about themselves. And in only one case, when there's a lot of public pressure, when only public need to justify intrusion, that's when you can just talk about or intrude someone's privacy, but that too in limitations. For example, there's a story that there's a victim or there's a disease and you're trying to hide it, but there's a larger public interest that the man who's carrying disease, people want to know about it because their public safety is related to that, or that area in particular needs to be highlighted because there's a big risk, or there's pandemic, there's a disease or something like that. Then that, in that larger interest, you can do that. But that doesn't mean that you just go out into their homes, you start taking out the pictures, making it viral. And it's becoming even more difficult with especially the technology, especially the YouTubers, and especially the social media networking sites with no gatekeeping. It's becoming very difficult to control this privacy. But still, good journalistic practices demand, and this is how harm can be minimized if one starts to respect that yes, there's a certain degree of privacy to which every individual citizen is entitled to. And this is important. And similarly, then we have the young juveniles and victims of sex. We've seen that how our press is doing that. Usually we see flashy headlines coming out, flashy tickers coming out, even pictures being spread over. And mostly some of the news, even some of the news are fake. Like even today in Peshawar, some pictures were shared that a small little girl was a victim of some very heinous crime, but it turned out to be fake. That was all lies. But the damage has been done. The families are upset that their daughter, a young little daughter, she was shared all across social media networks, especially WhatsApp groups and different groups. And people were sharing videos without even confirmation. And that video was a fake video, and that has caused problem. That has caused problem to the family, to the young little girl, and the three little boys who are also engaged in that video, doing nothing, and they have been blamed as as criminals. They have been labeled as criminals. That's another perspective. How dangerous is that for families? And we all are aware of the cultural restraints and the society we are living in. So that's very important, that without any confirmation or without the need, there's no need to describe the names or make it flashy story just to sell it. And similarly, be judicious about naming criminal suspects before formal filing of charges. What we usually see is that even before the court announces any verdict, uh, criminals are made, uh, criminal suspects are just made genuine criminals even before a verdict is given. That's dangerous. I mean, in our press as well, a mulzim becomes a mujrim even before the court's decision. And that's dangerous, because this is what's happening and this is what's causing a lot of problem. Because how can a press, which is just uh, a glance to look into a society of the world, how can it perform the act of judiciary? It's not our job as journalists to call someone a criminal. It's for the courts to decide. So if the court's verdict is still pending, I think a lot of harm can be saved, or you can save, you can minimize the harm without naming the suspects. So it's very important, these little discussions to think about. And when we think about all these points, especially sensitivity and all these points, it's important to consider a very important point, that is empathy. So, yes, what is empathy and how it affects us as a journalist is basically the ability to walk in the shoes, to understand them. It's basically when you think or place yourself instead of the victims, and so you start thinking on their lines. What would have happened had it been you? How would have you reacted if this has happened to you? For example, if you go to a war zone and you see people who have been displaced, and you start thinking, how would had it had affected you if it was you? Similarly, we're looking at children who are displaced or trauma victims. So when you think on their lines, from their perspective, that really changes the whole essence of journalism. Now, what we mostly see the problem, especially where the harm is mostly done, is that we write stories from our perspective. We think about the victims from our perspective. For example, what we usually see the people living in Islamabad or Karachi when they go to the war zones in Pakhtunkhwa, they start thinking about, mostly we see the problems that they start thinking about the stories from their own perspective. So what happens is that they write the story from the center to periphery perspective, and they really lose the essence of what the local indigenous knowledge is. So what happens is that for good journalistic practices, one must spend some time in the region. One must be aware of the cultural norms. One must be aware of the consequence society, or what has been the prevailing norms of that society, and only then after that you can empathize with them. And that's what journalism is. We don't believe in sympathy. As a journalist, there's no sympathy for people. You just can't act like that. But empathy gives you a sense of what is happening to the victims, what would have happened if it had been you, how should, and this is what gives you an edge before you go out and question people. Now, especially who are the victims of crime, especially who are victims, and you start thinking your questions. If you are sensitive, if you have compassion, that already means that you're empathetic, and that's what helps journalism in serious times. This is what war journalism also teaches us, to be empathetic towards the cause, because these are the victims. And what we normally see is that through rash journalism, through speedy journalism, what we end up doing is that we blame the victims. So, empathy is the key that can help you understand the victim's perspective. It will give you a wider perspective. It gives you an edge to analyze things in better context, and which already leads towards quality journalism. So, this is what we're looking forward to come out with quality journalism. So, the questions now for the students is that after attending this session, so do you think that harm be minimized while practicing good journalism? Do you think that if we focus on good practices or media ethics, can we minimize the harm? Is there a tool? Is there a toolkit? Is there a discussion session? Is there any guidance related to words like empathy that can help you? Or do you have to go with the flow just as it is going, what YouTubers are doing, what media channels are doing, what sensational journalists are doing? Do you think, is there a better way to minimize harm? And do you think these ethics, especially the virtues like compassion, sensitivity, empathy, do you think it can help? And how do you see Pakistani media in this context? Do you think that Pakistani media it violates ethics, especially when it comes to television journalism? And do you think the stories that are being published, do you think that has sensational content? Do you think that commercialism has led to breaking stories, regardless of thinking about people and the victims? So this is a lot to think about. And related to this, do you think that are there any latest stories where you think ethics were violated? And there have been lots of stories breaking up on social media and the internet. Especially sometimes we see that some stories that breaks on internet are followed by the mainstream channels as well. So there's a lots of stories in Pakistan that you can think where ethics were violated. Do you think any story that were published you could have done better as a journalist? So the next question is that if you were a journalist, how would have you covered a particular news story which didn't follow ethics? So yes, there's a lot to think about when it comes to media ethics, and when you think about Pakistani media in the context. And it's important to think about these questions because this will help you become a better journalist. Because what the problem with media is that it's so speedy, it's so fast, that as a young journalist, when you join a media organization, you just go with the stream, you just go with the flow. Your bureau chief asks you to go and cover a story. It's so much happening. There's a little time for reflection. This is why media ethics subject is so important in student life, is that you can think about these lines in advance. You can think that your story can do good, your story can damage as well. Your words have consequences, your images can be consequential. It can all have an impact. So always think that you are a journalist with a lot of power, and if your aim of journalism is upholding truth, balance, fairness, how you can maintain that? Because if bad journalism practices come into way, obviously the virtues of journalism or the promise of journalism will go away, because that's not what the main aim of journalism is then. So these little things, especially related to harm limitation, is very important, especially in the era of digital speedy journalism. And it's even more important because what you say becomes viral within minutes. The stories you share online can become viral without even thinking, without any hurdles. So this is where it's very important to think about these questions. I hope you enjoyed this session. These are some of the references we have used. Obviously, the book is of Wilkins and Christians, which is 2020 edition. It's a very good book on media ethics. So we'll be talking more about it. We'll be sharing some of the questions on our social media page as well. So you can ask questions, and we'll be in touch. So it's very important to think about these lines, because at the end of the day, media ethics will differentiate your class of journalism or your quality of journalism compared to what's in the market. Because at the end of the day, we are looking forward to quality journalism, and these little things can help us achieve those standards. So I hope you enjoyed the session. We'll be in touch. Thank you very much once again.